welcome to Ludonarrative Dissidents in a very special episode brought to you by one of our backers, Christian Biklee. Thank you so much for your support, Christian. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about we could say an obscure game, Outlaws of the Water Margin. This is a game that was written and released kind of in the late 90s. It is a game inspired by the historical epics of ancient China, 12th century China. That is the subtitle, Heroic Adventure Role-Playing in 12th Century China. It is written by Paul Mason. And this episode is dedicated to Christian's friends, Nathanael, Paul, Ben, and Jordan. They are his friends who he played Outlaws with back in the day. Yeah, so this is a game even I had not heard of, and that takes a bit because part of my regular podcasting is digging up obscure role-playing games to talk about. So it's pretty impressive.
I, on the other hand, have a playtest credit in it.
So
seriously, I do. This is because I used to roleplay with Paul Mason in the late 80s and early 90s in South London at the time when a lot of the interesting bits of the UK role-playing scene were going on in South London. Paul had, like many of us, like myself as well, come up through fanzines and then got a job as assistant editor or deputy editor on White Dwarf, when White Dwarf was a role-playing magazine rather than a Warhammer magazine. Didn't move up to Nottingham when the whole transition to Warhammer began. Stayed in London, working as a journalist and editing Games International, which was an early board games magazine, and living underneath Ian Marsh, who had been the editor of White Dwarf at the same time, and playing a lot of role-playing games. And I used to game with them on a regular basis, playing an early version of Outlaws of the Water Margin, also a lot of Empire of the Petal Throne, usually with Jamie Thompson, who was another ex-editor of White Dwarf, who had preceded both Ian and Paul, and Dave Morris, who I mentioned in the Apocalypse World episode, who one of the great designers of solo game books, one of the great pioneers of doing interesting and, in some cases, mad things with the form, who had also been the best-selling author in the UK in about 1990 or 1991 for writing a lot of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles books. These...
I have to interrupt. When you say we were doing all this back in the 80s, I can only picture you with the big kid and play eraser head haircut and like the block color 80s clothes, like the big parachute pants. It was exactly right like that, right?
It was Thatcherite London. It was grey.
Right.
And we're going to come back to that because there's elements of that in this game. Pretty much, well, I was a student. I was out marching every weekend going, what do we want? Grants, not loans. When do we want them? Sometime soon would be nice. We were very polite. Mm-hmm. I could go on a complete digression at this point about my student years. I won't. But they were fantastic role-playing sessions. Paul was one of the pioneers of new thinking in role play. He had this fantastic fanzine called Imazine, in which he put forward ideas of where we could take this art form. And it was clear to him that it was an art form. He was one of the champions of what became the text of the British new role play scene and became one of my core books for design principles, which is Keith Johnstone's Impro, which is actually a book about improvisational theatre. And it's probably the best book about games design ever written, even though it's not actually about games design. I recommend it very, very highly.
Is it in print?
It is in print, yeah. It's one of the core texts of improvisational theatre and improvisational comedy. Johnstone was one of the people he was one of the angry young men of British theatre in the 50s and 60s, founded a lot of that, founded a lot of the improv movement, came up with a lot of its kind of core rules. And it's a great book. And Paul wrote a lot about that and was inspired by that. And what I find kind of interesting about Outlaws of the Water Margin is that there's not an awful lot of that in there. Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which is my game inspired by Keith Johnstone, is pure improv. Water Margin is rather less so. But Paul was inspired, I believe, to write Outlaws of the Water Margin by seeing this TV series in the 70s and 80s, which had been made in China, called The Water Margin, which I never saw. I think there were 2 series of it. But it was, TV budgets rather than movie budgets, but that kind of heroic fighting that one become accustomed to later on, seeing films of Soy Hark and the Shaw Brothers, and as that stuff starts to filter through properly into the West. But at the same time, it's got all the cultural values. The other influence, I think, is actually one of the other 4 great books of Chinese literature. And that's not my term, that's the official term. There are 4 great terms. Outlaws of the Water Margin, Journey to the West, which is the monkey legend, basically, the great monkey story. There was also a monkey TV series, hugely influential, certainly in the UK. And I can't remember the other 2. Jeez, I've got them written down somewhere. They are less heroic. There's less sword fighting in them, I think. Right. Fewer flying clouds. But also, certain movies were starting to come through. The Soy Hark movies, Zoo Warriors of the Magic Mountain, and Chinese Ghost Story.
One.
Oh, it's great! It's great.
I've heard it's great, but I never found it.
Yeah.
Even when there was a Chinese movie store in Naperville in the early 2000s, and I would go there and look for wuxia films that I'd read about in Feng Shui and find them, and I'm like, ooh, Heroic Trio, that's supposed to be good. Ooh, Drunken Master, neat. But I never found Zoo Warriors of the Magic Mountain.
I think it was on Netflix. I think it was on Netflix in the UK a couple of years ago.
Oh, well, Netflix UK, that's everything. Yeah. That's crazy. That's just it's like another country over there.
Yes.
The other 2 of the 4 classic novels, by the way, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Dream of the Red Chamber.
Never even heard of that one. But I am not an expert on Chinese history or Chinese literature. And having known Paul Mason, was he one? The thing that in our framework for Ludonarrative Dissidents, stage 1 is, what does this game do? And my take on that is it emulates Chinese pop culture versions of this Song Dynasty epic, or possibly sort of Western translations of revisions of that epic. So it's like Mason's scholarship meets Mason's fandom, but there are all these layers where it's like, okay, so Paul Mason is a British guy watching an English translation of a modern TV show based on this Song Dynasty legend. And I'm like, and there are a lot of layers in that onion, but I think it's probably that could be a positive as much as a negative if you are a fan of rich cross-cultural, what would you call that? Cultural interpenetration.
Yes. I don't think it's cultural appropriation.
Yeah, I mean, that's the accusation that could be leveled. If you're Edward Said, this could be troubling. But I mean, the Orientalism challenge is, does it show every part of everything, east of Turkey as sort of this single monoculture? And certainly this isn't that. Mason's like, okay, this is about China, specifically this time in China, specifically this vision of this time of China, and it's very specific about what the Water Margin story is.
Yes, it's very firmly set in. I mean, it was written during the Ming Dynasty about the Song Dynasty, and it's not just very firmly fixed in the Song Dynasty. It's fixed in a 13-year period, which is when the heroes were supposed to be active, and the Outlaws of the Water Margin. And it's worth talking a bit about who they were. Basically, they're the kind of the Chinese equivalent of Robin Hood, or perhaps more accurately, almost King Arthur, because they are absolutely heroes. But it's a collection of folk tales that came together under a single authorship 3 or 4 centuries after they are supposed to have originally happened. So it's this disparate group of stories and disparate group of characters coming together with common purpose. And the common purpose is usually that these were honourable men from they're all men, from all walks of life, from the great of society right down to boat builders and butchers. But they've all been laid low by interactions with corrupt bureaucrats. Almost entirely, that it is the state that has demeaned them, usually through corruption, and they have become outlaws. Which in the game, pretty much, if you're an outlaw, you're a hero. You're one of the 108 heroes, and they are named in the back of the book. And it's very, very tightly focused on that. This is nothing like a lot of the games that were coming out about the same time. I don't know when Paul started work on The Water Margin. We were playing it, I would guess, late 80s, early 90s.
Wow.
When I was running Hogshead Publishing, I approached Paul about possibly publishing it, and that, to my guess, would be probably 98 or 99, because I can date it by which office we were in at the time. We were sharing an office with Pro Fantasy Software, which became Pelgrane Publishing. And I remember having the folder there. And it didn't come to anything because I wanted to make some editorial changes, but because it still felt at that point like an early 90s role-playing game. And I asked Paul if he'd make a bunch of changes, and he disagreed, and we went our separate ways.
Exhaustion and... Yeah.
I don't know if I should say at this point that that's the same reason I turned down Unknown Armies.
Because it looked like early 90s instead of...
No. I asked for another editorial pass on it, and I think Tynes declined.
We were already... Yeah, we were pre-exhausted, probably.
I don't blame you.
Well, so what we've got then, the version I have lists the copyright as 1998.
Mm-hmm.
And it is very much an artifact of its time, which is something I think we've decided we're going to get into later. But before we do that, before we sit up on the porch with a glass of country time ranting at the youth about how it was a different time in the 90s, you weren't there. What I want to do is kind of dig into the mechanics on this, which the mechanic is funky. It is the way it works. There's a target number of difficulty, but the higher that number is, the easier it is. So 12 is just a mortal lock because you're trying to equal or get under it on 2 6-sided dice. So you can't fail at difficulty 12. But you also don't want, but counterintuitively, you don't always want to roll low, because if you do succeed, your degree of success is determined by your highest die. And the higher that is, the better your success. So you've got this kind of Price is Right dynamic. You want to get as close to your ease number without going over it. So the neat thing about that is that it's self-stabilizing. Hard tasks inherently limit the success. But the part I really liked about it and thought was not utilized nearly to sufficient advantage was that there was this big pile of skills, and in true 90s fashion, they're subdivided and cost different things and apply at different times, and some are very broad and some are very narrow, and it's fiddly to the extreme. But you could apply multiple skills to a roll, and the way the skills work is they raise the difficulty, and remember, higher difficulties are easy. So if I have a skill where I'm like, okay, I can just use my coordination on that, then my coordination gets added to the target number and makes it a couple points easier. But it's like, oh, I'm coordinated, but also it'll help that I'm very strong, and also that I'm an expert at kicking things. And now I've got 3 factors involved. And what occurred to me, and again, the other thing we're going to do after we reminisce at immense length about the 90s, I'm sure, is talk about how we would rework this game for 2021. And I'm like, what I would do is just make it be just like, yeah, see how many skills you can bolt onto your action. See how much of your character you can get firing on this. If you can find a way to get your kicking skill and your social class and your knowledge of Chinese classics involved in your attack, you will be unstoppable. And I think that could be really fun because it plays into the crazy chaos of creativity that role players are known for when they are trying to describe their character clobbering somebody.
Mm-hmm. It's got almost like a Fate kind of system with aspects. I think. I mean, that's what it sounds like. Is that kind of
you don't define them though? They are.
Okay.
It's just this huge laundry list. They're weird. Well, no, they're not weird. They're 90s.
Yeah, I would agree with, especially with the 90s fiddliness. The combat chapter in particular is very lengthy, and yeah, when we get into how to redesign it, that would be like one of the first things I would be looking at, because like the core system is so simple, yet they add so many conditional things to it.
Special cases.
Yeah.
The 90s was before we'd learned that you should just, that if you see a special case, you should just put a bullet in its head and leave it by the side of the road. You should just, they should be able to find a modern game designer by following the trail of murdered special case rules.
But I mean, it's worth saying the 90s were a different time. We are going to come on to this. There were fewer role-playing games. There were, every art form is built on what came before. There were fewer points of reference. There were fewer things that one could look at. Probably the most avant-garde role-playing game was Amber Diceless or Over the Edge. And we were still using those kind of as touchstones.
Wait, can you believe there's a game where you just say what your character can do? There's no skill list, man. There's no skill list. You're in the Twilight Zone.
I am still basing stuff off, the old West End Ghostbusters. But yeah, it was simply fewer points of reference. And also in the UK, the small press stuff was not coming through. We weren't getting the, what we got basically was that Games Workshop, who at the time were a games distributor and also republisher, but they were the company that was bringing stuff in from the States. If they thought it was commercial, they'd bring it in. If, they weren't interested in little, Xerox homebrew systems, of which there were a few, I didn't see an awful lot of stuff that I'd heard of, but I only ever found it when I came over to Gen Con in 1989 for the first time and was running around going, oh my God, it's Greeks and Crawdads. I finally have a copy. And then discovered that it's not the game I was told it was. But more of that another time. So, I mean, I think there's some really interesting mechanics in here, not just for the time. I think it holds together really well. I think a lot of some of the special case stuff, it adds flavor. It's all there to add flavor. And what the mechanics do really well is capture that flavor, again, not just of this kind of vague Orientalism that a lot of other games were doing at the time. There was an awful Eric Wujik thing for Palladium. Generally, it was just kind of, it's all the Far East, just all in one massive, great blender. And Paul, he eviscerated that in some review.
Was that Ninjas and Super Spies?
He may have done a historical one as well, but yes, Paul just ripped it apart. He loathed that book. It's very focused on not just getting the details of the fiction right, but also getting the tone right and enabling the players to get it right as well. And he makes a point at one point of it suggesting that players read through stuff or possibly read the novels to get the tone. But I think the mechanics, just playing with the mechanics, you get the ability to understand how these heroes function, what they can do and how they can do it in a way that, and this won't be necessarily important to a lot of players, but in a way that is relatively true to the fiction. And this was one of his design tenets, that you start with your fiction first, work out what it is that you're trying to model, design mechanics to model that. If you can, I don't know if Imazine, 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 some people pronounce as Imazine, which you could read it that way. But it was a pun on the magazine that TSR UK had produced, which was Imagine. So it was a fanzine form of that. If there are copies still out there on the net for download, there's still some really interesting stuff in there. Also some very embarrassing stuff by me in the letter column. How old was I? Old enough to know better. I was still basically a student, or just after student years. I wrote a lot of crap.
Well, everyone has a past, James.
Yeah, as a friend of mine says, as a writer, you just accept that your first million words will be rubbish and just get them out of the way as quickly as possible.
I think it's a different number for everybody. Some people have but I have pictured the process of becoming a good writer as like mining, and you have to break through this crust of terrible fiction or terrible whatever you're creating before you can get down to where it's good.
Oh God, I did 9 issues of a fanzine that I won't even tell people the name of anymore. It's so embarrassingly bad.
Nice. Yep. Okay. That's your slag heap. That was you developing your juvenilia. And
learning the trade.
The good news is that people today, all that shit's on itch and archived forever, and or is taking place in their Twitter feed or Facebook posts. So yeah, I mean, you think we have it hard in that our embarrassing youth excesses can be found with digging. The youth of today, their embarrassing excesses can be found with a few keystrokes. All right. Should we talk about Bad Joss?
Yes. Let us talk about Bad Joss.
Yeah, that did stand out to me as a very interesting mechanic. I also do want to say, though, just in general, this is for the listeners at home. If you can find the PDF, I mean, good luck. I have no idea. I do not believe this game is distributed anywhere, so you have to know someone. We were sent the PDF by Christian again. Thank you. And it's divided evenly, about 100 pages of mechanics, and actually about 120 pages of mechanics, and then the remaining 80 pages of setting material. It's 196 page PDF. Just to give you an idea of the scale of this game.
It's pretty big.
I believe it is up. It is up there on the net. There is a PDF within a Google document which you can download, and it's free. And I will say now that I have paid much more money for much worse games than this. It's not complete. It's clearly an abandoned work. There are bits where the section headings just tail off into a list of things clearly to be fleshed out later that never were. But it is complete, and it is playable in the form that it's up.
It's laid out. It has art, but it does seem to be like almost ready for publication. It's designed, but there's no editing credits listed. So I don't know if it was 100% ready for publication yet. But clearly, this is not like a fantasy heartbreaker or anything.
Know. What I have to weigh in about is the use of the future conditional tense. It's another game where every page I'm circling will, because it's like, if you do this, the spirits will answer, instead of if you do this, the spirits answer. It could be 180 pages if they'd just taken out every instance of the future conditional tense. I could go on, and I am holding myself back. But yeah, it's got it. It's got the future conditional plague.
Yeah. I'm going to say I'm pretty sure it was laid out using PageMaker, because it was the late 90s, and Paul used to use PageMaker. Actually, he used to use, wasn't Quark. There was another one before that. Yeah. But yes, the layout is rudimentary, but it's functional. All the information's there. It's clearly laid out by somebody who understands layout. It's not a bad looking game. It's very readable.
Compared to some of the White Wolf stuff from the 90s. I mean, at least he doesn't have white letters on gray texture. which I may have mentioned before. But we were going to do Bad Joss.
Yes, sorry. Sorry.
So Bad Joss in the game is one of the limiting factors placed on players, and the other is the energy stat. When I was looking at the thing where it's like, wow, you could just, if you were a very creative and imaginative and agile thinker, you could just pile stat upon stat upon stat upon stat into a task and knock it out of the park. But of course, Paul Mason anticipated this and gave you an energy stat, and you cannot add more bonuses than you have energy. And when bad things happen to you and you get tired, your energy diminishes, so you become less effective and less able to dogpile events into submission with a pile of skills. So that is sort of the mechanical chain around the character's throat, and the narrative chain around the player's throat is Bad Joss, which is... At one point he says, this is not just a stick for the GM to beat the players with. And until he'd written that, I'd like, this kind of does look exactly like a stick for the GM to beat the players with. But he's like, if you're
not
the GM...
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
He's like, if you're the GM, you have all the sticks you need. No, what this is for is to reinforce the superstitious behavioral norms of the time. If you do certain things, if you act certain ways, if you give in to individual personal motivation, you will accrue Bad Joss. And this is just like bad luck. And there are assorted ways of dealing with it. One is if you roll snake eyes, you immediately have to make a Bad Joss roll. And that will either be some misfortune that happens right away, which could range from, you embarrassingly soil your clothes up to getting hit by lightning, or else a more long-term thing where it's like, oh, well, you get sick. Oh, there's a social misunderstanding. And all the Bad Joss effects are very easily dismissed as, oh, these are just things that happen, man. It's not like you have Bad Joss, the skies open up, and angels descend to kick your ass. It's, you have Bad Joss, so your sandal strap breaks and you twist your ankle. So it's stuff that, it's just bad luck. And so if you act like a very individualistic person, if you act like you're from the West and, believe in frontier spirit and sort of self-promotion, you will be racking up all kinds of Bad Joss. If you act like a Song Dynasty citizen who every relationship has someone on top and someone on the bottom, and know your place and stick to your place and enact your role correctly, then, Bad Joss will just glide off you. Or you'll get it for being in the wrong place at the wrong time because the feng shui was bad, or because you buried grandpa in an inauspicious location. That's the other way you get Bad Joss. But it is, again, another limiting factor. It's like, yeah, you can get this short-term advantage by being motivated, but boy, yeah, the nature of reality doesn't much care for your individualism.
Bad Joss is great. I really like what Bad Joss does. And it fits in. There's a little suite of mechanics, and some of them are exactly what you'd expect to get in a game set in China. There's the face mechanic, and there's, the reputation stuff and things like that. But it's all done with a certain finesse to it. It's not used as kind of a blunt sword. It's well integrated within the characters, within the character sheets. It's clever. It feels clever. There's an elegance and a deftness to it that really works. The version I played, 30 years ago, at least, was not this version. This version is several versions further on. It is more polished. It is cleverer. It is better integrated. I really like what it does to bring that atmosphere out mechanically. I think the tone of it is it's well written, it's well expressed. Paul can be wordy at times, and it shows that it hasn't been through a proper editing process. There's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of, this is one of the reasons for publication. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be altered in there or integrated or just restructured. But you read it through once and you've basically got it, and it comes together. And I certainly felt on a single read through, I could run this. I'd probably need to refresh on certain bits, but I felt confident that I could capture the tone that the creator was after. And that's pretty big.
That's not nothing. I mean, it's not hard for me to imagine an alternate universe where this sort of mechanic, this compact roll 2d6, try to get right up to the difficulty but not go over, became the default in the same way that D20 is the default now. D20 is maybe a little simpler. It's probably a bit simpler than this. But this is not baffling and puzzling, and I can see how, like the D20 mechanic at the core of the D&D 3 edition reboot, this is a mechanic that is probably pretty robust. It can take a punch. It can take a lot of house ruling without breaking. You could vary it a lot of different ways to make it fun and interesting.
It doesn't feel like a new dice mechanic for the sake of being a different dice mechanic. It feels like it has been carefully designed for a purpose.
So,
Indeed.
James, one thing that I did note in the sort of copyright page of this PDF is that this is based on another system, Dave Morris's Kwaidan. And Kwaidan is a Japanese set of ghost stories. And so it's about, I guess, that sort of ancient Japanese folklore and fantasy and that sort of thing. So I could not find much information about that. Looking online, apparently it was mentioned in an issue of White Dwarf in 1983, or is so.
Oh my god!
Yeah, I don't know. There is So do you recall anything about this system? Because apparently this is not the first RPG that has this system. It was taken from
Kwaidan is before my time, which that's old.
I don't remember it. I don't remember ever coming across Kwaidan. I've come across some of Dave's work on RPGs set in Japan because he wrote the book that was going to be the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition Japanese source book, basically, which I think wasn't set in Yamato. I think it was set in Nippon, being the name of it was the 80s. We didn't understand a lot of stuff at that point about cultural sensitivities. Kwaidan, I don't know, but the bell it's ringing, and I could be completely wrong on this, is Dave's Tirikelu system, which is his mechanics for Emperor of the Petal Throne, which is a really nice system. Oh, one other member of the group I should have mentioned, Dr. Patrick Brady was an occasional player. He went on to be the lead designer on Guardians of Order's Tecumel version of the Emperor of the Petal Throne game system and world. I could be completely wrong in this, but I think there may be an overlap with Tirikelu. But Kwaidan itself, I don't know. Let me footnote that. I do talk to Dave from time to time. He was my best man. And is, I think, godfather to at least one of my children.
It's interesting you mentioned these other...
You gotta think about it. All right.
Takumo, because it's also, like, I think one of these sort of, like, immersive culture sort of RPGs like that and Pendragon, which is all about being in a particular place and time and focusing on that as the backdrop. And not just as a backdrop, but, like, as an integral part. Like, in a lot of role-playing games, the setting is more or less just set dressing, like D&D, it's just like, there's the kingdom, don't worry about it. Focus on the monsters you have to kill.
Yes. Well, and that's, okay, that could be our segue into the 90s were a different time, kids. Because there was this feeling that you had to have a big-ass background. And if you didn't, how were you going to sell supplements? How were you going to have a revenue stream? And I'm sympathetic to this, because if you have a game that sells well and people want to buy more supplemental materials for it, then great. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to create a whole new game that may succeed or fail. But it does tend to... The way people proceeded was, okay, I've released D&D. I guess I need to release a bunch of modules for it and a bunch of Adventures and Dungeons. But the problem with Adventures and Dungeons is that only the DMs buy those. So then they're like, oh, well, what about more player option books and more books of spells and books of treasure and things that players like? Because it's a much bigger pool. And
Splat books.
If you have splat books, and the splat book apex was White Wolf. And what year did first edition Vampire come out? That was
91. I was there.
91. And they sold Vampire, what the people who were playing Vampire seemed to really like. They liked getting new powers and new fiddly bits and new rules stuff. But they also really liked getting new pieces of setting. And it's like, oh, here's the setting book for Milwaukee, and here's what this particular breakaway faction of vampire malcontents is doing. And that is a lot easier to produce than tight, innovative mechanics. And so there was this expectation by 1998 that, yeah, if you're, when people buy games, they want to have a huge world. They want to have details and know what it smells like when you walk through the marketplace, and they want to know what people's religions and habits are like. And, and I dig that. I myself enjoy sitting down to the 7-course meal of setting. But that does not seem to be the way a lot of people are doing it these days, because the modern approach is, I want this game to be as short as possible so that it doesn't cost $90 and I don't have to and I don't have to deal with a gigantic printing, shipping, editing, art thing. I want to make a small game, especially if you're starting out.
Well, if you're indie, obviously I think at the high end, they still lean towards the big fuck all book, because they can sell, and also it's compatible with fifth ed, and hey, here's a whole line of miniatures to go with it.
So the middle, as with so much in our modern world, the middle has been eliminated. You are either Dungeons and Dragons, Delta Green, and other huge full color hardback books sitting on Olympus, or you are a PDF only $1 million soulmate grubbing in the puddles at the foot of the hill. And there's no middle class.
There's a few. Kickstarter has enabled a few, I think. But it tends to be people, they kickstart the rule book and they'll do a deluxe version, and then they kickstart the next supplement. And then there's Monty Cook.
Yeah.
Monty seems to have it figured out.
I think so.
Yeah, but definitely the splat book market has business model of the 90s has gone away. Do you think this is Outlaws of the Water Margin would have, had it been published, would it have gone that way with supplements for, new spells and new adventures and that kind of thing?
It's very difficult to say.
Yeah.
Paul talks at one point about writing a supplement for it, but I think he just describes it as a supplement.
Yes.
I don't think he describes it in any more detail than that. Yeah. And in the 90s, it was quite possible. I mentioned Amber Diceless. Amber Diceless had one supplement. It was a hugely successful role-playing game, blew through tens of thousands of copies, more. One supplement in its entire publishing history, plus a fanzine. And it was quite possible because there were fewer titles, therefore the titles sold more per system. You could make a living on that. You could run a company on it. These days, there's so much product. There's so many names out there.
Well,
I gave up trying to keep track of even the mid-ground role-playing games years ago.
moreover, with the internet and with everyone being extremely online, if I want to make money from my role-playing game writing, I'm not just competing with other professional game writers. I'm competing with the guy who's giving it away for free, who, oh yeah, I wrote up this 80-page thing, working over the course of 2 years on weekends. I don't really want to make any money off it. I'm just going to stick it up on my website and see if anyone downloads it.
Yeah. And you're also competing with every other role-playing game ever published, because they're all up on drive-thru. And, some of them at ridiculously low prices. But apart from Creeks and Crawdads.
What is the bee in your bonnet about Creeks and Crawdads? You're like...
I'm redesigning it. It's a passion project for me. It's all right, okay, because I think it was Paul who told me this, so it does connect. Creatures and Crawdads, one of those games that word spread around vaguely. Somebody had heard about it or seen a copy. It's a post-apocalypse game. I don't know if you guys know anything about it.
I've heard of it, but I've not seen it.
Okay, it's a 24-page Xerox thing. Zocchi might have been involved in publishing it. I think I finally bought my copy from Lou Zocchi.
That sounds right.
24-page post-apocalypse game. You all play members of the most intelligent race surviving the nuclear apocalypse, because it came out in the 80s. These things were still very much on our minds, which is to say that you are an intelligent mutated crawdad. Unfortunately, even an intelligent mutated crawdad is still incredibly stupid. And the way it was described to me by, I believe, Paul, is that your character sheet has 4 or 5 slots on it for the things you can remember. And if you want to... That was my reaction. That's so good. I have to see this game.
It's like Memento, only with radioactive crustaceans.
Exactly. So I finally find a copy 5 years later, going, this is going to be great. And that mechanic is not in there. So I can only assume that Paul somehow extrapolated from a combination of reading the 1-paragraph description in someone's fanzine of this thing and just inventing this thing. But what I am now working on is a game that does have that mechanic, which I don't have a good title for it. The working title is Roach Hotel, but it'll be better. That's why I'm thinking a lot about Creeks and Crawdad. Anyway, but that as an example of a mechanic that just lies at the center of a game and absolutely defines the gameplay and the tone and the mood, I think Bad Joss does that. I think Bad Joss really sets the tone for the way that Water Margin characters interact with the world around them, because it's not just the way they interact with the corrupt bureaucracy that they will be going out as outlaws, but the natural world and the supernatural world around them. You have to pay attention to all these details for risk of acquiring further Bad Joss. It's not a big flashy mechanic, but I really like the tone of it. I think it's really clever.
This is why it's good that you actually played the game, because just reading through it, it did not jump out and poke me in the eye as being that central or evocative.
Mm-hmm.
So that's good to know.
It does remind me of Fate because of that Fate point compelling aspects mechanic where GMs can essentially bribe players, or compel them, essentially, like your character's superstitious, you have this superstitious aspect, so if you want to walk under the ladder, you have to pay a fate point, or I'll give you a fate point if you run away or you stop chasing the person because he runs under a ladder and you dare not follow, or something like that. It would have been interesting to see how this game would have been received and what it would have influenced had these kind of mechanics been widely distributed. It makes you wonder, what if this had been seen by a larger public?
Totally.
Yeah.
But okay, and are we in the 90s now? Are we talking about the 90s?
I'll just pick up on that point. A shame it's not been seen by more people. I think if it had been published in the 90s, not by Hogshead, because we more or less knew what we were doing.
Ouch.
I think there's a good chance that it would have kind of disappeared simply because of the setup at that point. There were no ebooks. There were no, almost nobody was selling ebooks in any form in the 90s. It would have required physical copies. Paul was based in the UK. He lives out in Japan now. I'm still occasionally in contact with him. I've just been going through the playtester list. There's a name that may not mean much to you guys, but Tim Hartford in the middle of that at the time would have been a student at Oxford, but is now the BBC's Tim Hartford, well-known broadcaster, known as the Undercover Economist, and best-selling. And when I say best-selling, I mean literally number one paperback, best-selling pop economist in the UK.
Wow.
And he play-tested Outlaws of the Water Margin.
Crazy.
So that doesn't really lead anywhere, but I wanted to point that out. He's also lovely. He's a really nice man.
Okay. Brought
Anyway.
chips when you were gaming?
Very probably, yes. Many interesting foods were brought. There's a whole page on cuisines in the book.
That's a 90s thing, man.
It is, but again, it's kind of evocative. I remember Paul and a chap called Mike Cool, who you will have seen on screen because he played the Vogon. Michael Kuehl played the Vogon Guard in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy TV adaptation. But he and Paul Mason threw a Tecumel banquet at a games convention, which apparently involved going into the local delicatessen with a £50 note and saying, "Give me the weirdest foods you have," which were all eaten. And it was just a sublimely delightful role-playing experience. Yes, so there's a page of cuisines, and it's evocative. It sets a tone, it sets a mood. What would your characters be eating? And it depends very much on the social class. And you go, wow, a full page of that. That's great. And then the next page, there's one page on, here's the sample town where your characters might live. One page. Perhaps I would have prioritized that differently, but the cuisine stuff is just lovely.
Yeah,
if I paid for it, I might be miffed that there was only a page at the time.
It's I liked the detail that, oh yeah, if you're a Taoist, you don't eat wheat because that feeds the 3 worms of corruption that live in everybody's body. And I'm like, well, damn. Well, I made notes. I have notes about the 90s culture of gaming, and there was much less of a presumption that the GMs and players would cooperate, and a much greater assumption of sort of an antagonistic stance between them. And you can see that, I think you can see a little of that in here, but also you can see a resistance to it, or a recognition that, hey, everybody, this is maybe an unexamined habit we have left over from Tomb of Horrors, that things might get better if we examined it a little bit. Because, there are parts where he's like, yeah, maybe just don't have bad faith competition with your GM. Because A, the GM will cream you, but also because B, it's less fun. So that was, an element. There is the big packed in references, because in the 90s you couldn't just go to Wikipedia and look up what, ancient Chinese measurements were like, or military ranks in the Song dynasty. In terms of the history of the hobby in particular, I'm like, mechanics back then were extremely fiddly and riven with special cases. And I think where we've gotten to now, was there ever really a hard overcorrection of that, where it's just like super simple games that were never huge? I mean, people tried and and that's where we got the derisive phrase magical tea party. But what this says to me is that complexity is not necessarily bad if it's fascinating complexity. Chess and the emergent complexity of chess persistently fascinate people because it does give you something meaty to sink your brain into. But the problem of a lot of 90s design was people going, oh, I love this. I love the intricacy of this part. I'm going to make everything the intricate part. And I think what we've moved to now a little bit more is a situation where it's like, yeah, the game is about X, so the rules about X are going to be very intricate and tactical and absorb your attention and be the thing you want to keep pawing at. But all this other stuff can just be handled very simply. As sort of a preview of coming attractions, we're doing Lancer at some point, and I've just started looking at it, and it looks like, yeah, there's a hard division between here's the part that's fiddly, where you shoot each other, and here's the part that's not fiddly, which is everything else. So there it is. That is a lesson I feel like we've learned, is the management of rule density, and that it is a resource that is good when you want it and bad when you don't want it, and that a lot of good design is knowing the difference between the two and using it sparingly. Sound right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, in general, I think a game that knows what it wants to do and focuses on that is in a much better position than what a lot of games are, which are like, it can do everything, and it doesn't really work. Even GURPS says here, don't implement every single system we have presented to you.
You'll go mad.
You'll go mad. Like, if you want to don't put mass combat and organization rules in a game that's not about that, even though we have these rules in GURPS. So I think Outlaws is very focused on, again, being this particular time and place and this culture.
Parts of it are too fiddly.
The rules are too fiddly. Like,
it does have mass combat rules, as you were just saying. But then there's also a thing that your player character is assumed to have a bunch of followers and acolytes who will follow them around. There's some discussion of that. I will say that everything in there is in there because Paul thought had a reason for it to be there. He was a guy who had written extensively about structuring role-playing games, creating evocative rules and stuff. He wasn't just somebody who sat down and wrote a game about something he loved. He had thought a great deal about the craft of creating and running particularly culture-based evocative role-playing experiences. And I think, although this is very much of its time, it is a very good example of that time. And it does what it does very well.
Our last section is, instead of why people play it that way, because this game is very hard to find and very few people heard about it, except for those who were around for the playtesting and maybe personally knew the author. Greg had the great idea of, well, if I ran the water margin, here's how I would remodel it. Here's how I would redo it. And for me, obviously, I think the first thing I would do is, honestly, actually, I keep going back to Fate. I kept being reminded of Fate in terms of the skills and the aptitudes, and just it very much felt like a Fate game. And again, that would make it far more marketable, and also just make it a lot easier for people to run, because Fate has a pretty standardized way of dealing with fighting and challenges and obstacles, and it just works. And I would definitely, I'm not an expert in the Chinese literature or history, so I would definitely find an expert in this to sort of verify it. I mean, everything in it seems like it was written very like with an eye to detail, with someone who knows the material well, but I am a layperson when it comes to this, so I wouldn't know. So, and that's sort of the core of this game, is getting this material accurately and in an interesting way to role play it. So, so I would cut back on the rules, make it Fate, and expand more of the culture material, and sort of get a second person to like double check it, and like expand upon it. Because again, this feels like this is like this is like we mentioned before, that it's not edited. This is a personal work that was not published. So and Yeah, so that I don't have a whole lot else other than that is make it fade and get a historian to look over it and make a pass on it. James, how would you since you were so close to doing it?
That's the thing. For me, this is part of my role playing history. Admittedly, it's a hazy part, not least because there was often a haze in the room. Let's put it that way. Those were good evenings. And Chinese or Japanese beer as well, and good food, decent food. I've entirely forgotten one thing about the whole 90s thing. I mentioned it was Thatcherite London, and Britain was a very grey place at the time. I think there's an element of that within the game, whether Paul intended it or not, but this idea of being heroic outcast, pushed down by this bureaucratic system, and this intensely hierarchical thing that people bribed their way up to. There were elements, there were scandals within the Thatcherite government that, of course, dwarfed by the scandals we have now. But at the time, it felt like the country was being run by a corrupt regime and was squashing the life out of it. And it was the interesting stuff. It was the people who were kind of pushed to the edges of society that were doing the interesting rebellion. I think there are overtones of that. And I think that maybe, certainly in the UK, that's a timely thing. That's something, that mood is kind of coming back, regardless of what's about to happen in football this weekend. This will mean nothing to the American, but to everyone.
Nope.
There's football.
Single thing.
All football all the time.
When you said in Thatcherite London, it felt like you were at the mercy of an arbitrary and deeply corrupt homogenizing regime. It's a podcast, so you can't see it, but I'm making scare quotes with my fingers around. Felt like.
Yeah. Anyway, but what would I do with it? What would I do with the game? I'd give it the editorial pass that I wanted to give it in the late 90s. I'd restructure a lot of it. I would put an easy in there. I think the problem with a lot of culture games, not so much this one, but definitely stuff like Sky Realms of Jiroon, Empire of the Petal Throne, and RuneQuest. I mean, the father of great culture games. There is so much to digest for a newcomer to this world. It's really difficult for a new player, let alone a new GM, to understand enough about not just the structure of the world, but how it works and how to run a game in it. It needs a kind of a gentle in. And Empire of the Petal Throne, the original one, has one of the best intros, which is that in the standard, I believe in the TSR box set that came out in the mid-70s, you start off not as a citizen of the Soliani Empire, which is loosely speaking, the Roman Empire with more weird aliens and magic, and no metal. It's great, trust me, it's brilliant. But there's so much depth of culture in there. You don't start off as part of that. You start off as a barbarian from Haida Bakala, the barbarous lands to the south, who has come to seek their fortune in, because you've heard the streets are paved with, not gold, there isn't any gold, whatever metal it is. It's been a long time since I played Emperor of the Petal Throne. I may be weak on the details. So the game, the first scenario literally starts as your ship docks at Jakala, the great harbour, and you step out, and everything is alien to your character, just as it is alien to you, the player. So it's an excuse to kind of work slowly through understanding the way this society works.
A tutorial game.
Very much. It's a tutorial scenario. And it's I've nicked that opening so many times to introduce new role players to how the whole thing works.
That is the approach I took with Termination Shock, is that, human beings are cosmic hayseeds from a backwater who were just rescued from a disaster and dumped in the cosmic equivalent of New Jersey. And the alien guy who was supposed to acclimate you to everything kind of fucked off on the job because they were all just volunteers. So all they do is give you the hyperspace equivalent of a cell phone, and they're like, I guess you can live in that section of this weird space station. Bye!
Yeah,
It's been very, very fun. That's my moment of self-promotion.
That's fine. We're all allowed them from time to time. But I think Outlaws of the Water Margin relies slightly on the players being at least partly familiar with this world of particular style of historical fantasy Chinese culture, which is not the same that you get certainly in the modern day. This is not Jet Li's style of fantasy or Jackie Chan's. This is much more this very particular style of thing. And I'm sure they've remade several monkey movies recently. They do not have the same tone as the 70s monkey at all. I'd broaden it slightly. I'd make it more a kind of, Chinese historical myth thing. I'd probably take the power levels up a bit so you could be monkey. Everyone wants to be monkey. Monkey's so cool. But there's an awful lot of, and I'd take out some of the minor mechanics, I think, but otherwise I'd leave an awful lot of it as it is. I think it hangs together. I think it is a little bit old-fashioned, but that doesn't make it by any means unplayable. And I was filled with nostalgia as I read it, and not just for a particular time, but for the style of play, for the fun we had with it, and for the stories we told with it. I really want to thank our backer. I hadn't thought about the water margin for a while, and this was a really lovely excuse to go back to it and to it evoked an awful lot of very fun memories.
So that's very different from my approach. First off, because I have no nostalgia for the way it was. Very recently, actually, I've been talking about nostalgia with people and realizing that I do not experience it the way other people do. For me, nostalgia is almost universally painful. Even thinking about happy times from the past, I to me feels like looking into the coffin at an open casket funeral. So I'm like, yeah, is there any point in the past that I don't hate? And I'm like, wow, yeah, I really pretty much just am driving with the hammer down and never looking in the rear view. That's my psychological setup. And so for me, if you handed this to me, looking at the rules, I would put away the editorial scalpel and get out the editorial chainsaw. A lot of the special cases would just be gone. Everything, I'm like, if it's not fights, magic stuff, or socialization, it's radically simple. I would almost be like, if it's not in those three categories, just flip a coin. But by the same token, make everything you can, try and drag it into one of those three arenas. I would get rid of energy, the limiting factor on how many skills you can throw in to make things simpler. And I would say every ability just makes ease one more. So if you can get 8 abilities in play, now it's +8 to the ease. I would probably rename difficulty as ease, with the idea that, yeah, ease 12 sounds easier than ease 2. In the text, it's called difficulty, and it seems counterintuitive to me that difficulty 12 is easier than difficulty 2. It's like those old -10 armor classes being good. So I would do that. I'd rename that. And the trick would be, I'm like, yeah, rope in as many abilities as you can. And describe, but you have to describe narratively why you get to use them. And in my mind, I have this vague, cloudy picture of a character sheet with, it's not a list of abilities in the combat track. It's like a tree where it's like, okay, in order to throw someone, I need to grapple them first, which means I need to use coordination more than strength. And, if I'm using that, I can't use this, but I can, there's some skills that you can't use all the time. There's some with cooldowns. There's some where you have to do this one with it. There's others where you can't do these two together. And I do that for socialization too, building in all of the the face mechanics and the reputation and the social class and, are you older or younger than this person? Who owes whom respect? And, I'd try and get that all in so that is just as exciting as the combat stuff where it's like, okay, I'm going to convince this magistrate to let me off, and I'm going to pull in my pleading ability, but also my low social status and the family connection I have to him. But that, even though I'm a lowly peasant farmer, I'm also known as a good filially pious son. And, so the ease is way up high, and now I roll. And do the same thing with magic, where at the base of that sort of flow tree I'm envisioning is all the random superstitious stuff that everyone does. And then way down deep in it, you get Taoist immortals and Buddhists turning showing demons the error of their ways and making them come over to the light side. That's how and it would probably not feel very much like Outlaws of the Water Margin. But I suppose that is because I am more of a game designer and less of a historian of Chinese literature.
Yeah.
I can only be as God made me.
Yep. Yeah, so that's 3 different ways of yeah, if Paul is listening to this episode, maybe you should reconsider your I think if this was released now, there who knows? Certainly it could be a print on demand PDF. If nothing, print on demand book in PDF, if nothing else. But yeah, the Chinese literature in that era is sort of like a blind spot, and it's not because I'm not interested. I am interested. It's just, there's only so many hours in the day. So I would welcome more chances to explore history and literature through this kind of game.
I'm just going to jump in and say, for anyone who's thinking of running a game in China or using Chinese myth, even if you're not going to use the rules of Outlaws of the Water Margin, there's so much great reference material in there. It is... Paul, so far, was not a scholar of Chinese literature or anything like that, but it is really well researched. There's an awful lot of lovely detail in there about social hierarchies, the different styles of magic, all, from the books, but also from that style of cinema as well. And it doesn't cost anything. It is, if you just Google Outlaws of the Water Margin RPG, that should take you to the Google Drive. I've just dug it up myself. It is literally, it's a Google Drive file, and it's a PDF, 200-page PDF. You don't have to pay anything for it. Yeah, I as I say, I'm still in contact with Paul. I will encourage him to make it more widely available somewhere in some form.
Cool. So I think that concludes this episode. Again, I would like to thank our backer, Christian Biklee, and his friends, Nathanael, Paul, Ben, and Jordan for, certainly, I hope this, hopefully your experiences of nostalgia, Christian, are a little better than Craig's.
Yeah, it's only now occurring to me that, this is not normal. Lots of people like nostalgia. Not everyone looks at their past like it's a field full of undetonated landmines.
It drives a lot of RPG sales, nostalgia. There's a huge appetite for...
not just RPGs. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, no. And in that, perhaps uniquely, in that sense, I'm totally okay with it.
But our next episode, as we mentioned briefly on here, will be Lancer, the mecha sci-fi tactical combat focused RPG from Massive Press, the creators behind the webcomic Kill 6 Billion Demons. It is beautifully, Lancer is a beautifully illustrated, very weird sci-fi RPG game. So I'm looking forward to our discussion on that. I've played it once. I am thinking about running it again, running it myself. But it has a lot of interesting elements to it. For example, it has a app that people can use to manage things. So yeah, that's what we'll be working on next. I will post an update on our Kickstarter when we have a better idea of when that's going to be released. Probably with when I release this episode. So by the time you're going to check the Kickstarter for when we get a better idea. And then of course, once we release Lancer, I'll have a poll up. But I think that about wraps up this episode. Yep. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening. Good times.
Many thanks. Thanks for the chance to talk about this.
One note, during a break when recording this episode, James started talking about the UK game scene. I've included it here after the main episode. Enjoy.
I could talk for literally hours about this stuff. A lot of interesting stuff came out of those groups, and a lot of interesting... we would play at conventions because the UK is small. We have the advantage of being small, so everyone is, there's a convention in Leicester. Oh, that's 150 miles. You can jump on a coach and be there in 2 hours. So there were a lot of people who were seeing each other regularly and just not so much deliberately setting out to push the boundaries of what could be done with roleplay, but to have a good time and just, muck around. And I remember one game in Warwick University, I can't remember the convention, but it was like a day-long game, and it was a film festival. And people split up into teams and role-played themselves as members of this film crew and came up with and made, which is to say described, the movie that they were going to make. And then there was a screening, which is to say we all got on stage and acted out bits of it, and there was a presentation. So it wasn't in any way a conventional role-playing game, but it was huge fun. And I mean, actually, one of my kind of formative role-playing experiences was in a game with Paul. It was a big Empire of the Petal Throne game. And I think there must have been 12 people or so there. And we were all having a big kind of planning meeting. And I looked up and realized that Paul and his co-GM had left the room. They had gone to go and cook lunch. And they spent half an hour cooking lunch. And the game just continued without them. For me, that was mind-blowing. Just the idea that that could work. Even because I'd come out of a very GM-centric tradition of role-playing. The people I'd role-played with did so in a very GM-centric way. The idea that you didn't even need the GM, that it was enough to if everyone was present within the game world and understood its constraints, as long as nobody was going to go, let's start rolling some dice, possibly even then. And it was great stuff. But there wasn't really an outlet for it. There wasn't much of a UK press at that time. There wasn't, there were fanzines, there were convention games, but there was no way of bringing it to a wider market. I mean, we're still several years before any kind of interesting use of the internet or widespread use of the internet, and no ways of getting published. Because one thing that people discovered really quite quickly is that the UK scene in the late 80s to early 90s, once Games Workshop had stopped doing role-playing games, the market for role-playing games in the UK was not large enough to support a company that wanted to actually make a go of it on a professional level. Don't worry. And a number of companies tried it and went bust, or almost went bust. The only one I remember is actually Slay Industries, Nightfall Games, who survived by being bought out by Wizards of the Coast to become Wizards of the Coast UK. But Hogshead Publishing was the one that made the difference, he says, blowing his own trumpet, because I worked out a different business model, which was do not focus on the UK market. The UK market is tiny, pretends to be an American company. So we printed everything in America, warehoused in America, priced everything in dollars, and sold primarily to the American and Canadian market, which was an order of magnitude larger. And that was enough money to keep us going. And then that was other companies picked up that same business model, notably Mongoose, who surfed that wave of D20 stuff. I won't say what the wave was made of, but yeah.
The D20 shovelware, man, that's, Mongoose in a nutshell.
But that was kind of where the scene was in the early 90s. A lot of really interesting creative people.
Dow is.
Sorry, I talked at you.
Oh, that's okay. We're talking over each other. We'll get it straightened. Ross will fix it in post. But